thank you for attending. So yes, my name is Emmanuel Fournet. I'm the customer service leader in France and the Benelux for NielsenIQ. For those of you who don't know NielsenIQ, NielsenIQ is a data company that collects data from retailers, mass retailers. Think about Walmart, Carrefour, Tesco, Auchan, Leclerc, throughout the globe. We have a global footprint, presence in 110 countries, I think. And I'm here to tell you about a bit, because I have 25 minutes, about that very rich topic, to tell you about digital and how digital is impacting the food industry, how digital is impacting the food industry from various angles. So the introduction was very rich again. It seems like we're going to cover a lot of topics. And indeed, when we talk about digital in the food industry, there's a lot, basically, that we could discuss. There's a lot that we could cover. We could think about, obviously, new channels disrupting the food industry, so e-commerce, but also the way, and we're going to talk about that in details, but also the way digital is impacting the supply chain management, through data management mainly, but through many other aspects. Of course, personalization through digital promotion, through product recommendation, transparency, traceability of product, and also targeted recommendation for each individual based on whatever you've bought online before. I was talking a bit about traceability, transparency of product. Of course, digital is helping through many different ways to help consumers understand better what's in their plate, what they eat, what they drink, and blockchain capabilities as well. I think these are some of the topics that you guys are going to cover later with other SIAL talks this afternoon. And one last angle that we could mention about digital is how influencers are building opinions, are creating new trends, are creating new products. We have measured very recently that in France, for instance, one of the best product innovation has been developed by an influencer, by also a music artist, Mr. V. And this is a really good example of how influencers are shaping the food industry today. And of course, how they're shaping the food industry through their influence on the younger consumers, on the younger target, and how those people, the younger consumers, are behaving in a very different way versus older consumers. So there are basically a lot of topics that we could cover when we talk about digital on the food industry. Obviously, since I have only 25 minutes, I'm going to focus on e-commerce, on how e-commerce is changing the food industry. And since we're in Paris, or near Paris, I'm going to use the French example to tell you a bit about that. Before we jump into e-commerce and how e-commerce is changing the food industry with the French example, just wanted to share a few ideas and a few thoughts about the context where we are today, the context where French consumers are, but this is true, of course, throughout Europe and throughout the globe. The main disruption that we faced this year in 2022 and that we're going to face in 2023 as well is, and when it comes to food industry, of course, is inflation, which is something that we've never seen over the last 40 years. You will see some data a bit later, but you will see how the inflation levels that we're reaching has never been seen again over the last 40 years. And of course, this is impacting the consumer confidence. That's the chart that you see at the bottom of that slide, where basically in France, for instance, but this is true throughout Europe, the consumer confidence level are at the lowest level that we have ever measured in the latest 40 years. There's water dropping. So I was telling you about inflation. You can see here the level of inflation that the food industry is facing in France in September 2022. So basically price versus September 2021 have risen 5.6% versus last year on all what we call fast-moving consumer goods, which is basically everything that you can buy in an hyper or supermarket. This is, of course, driving a lot of behavior changes in the way people shop, in the way people consume, and we'll talk about how it's impacting, the e-commerce industry and the e-commerce for food industry. So one of the first impact that we can see driven by inflation, is how the FMCG business is growing in France in 2022. You can see that we have basically a 1.3, that's the number in green, a 1.3 increase in value sales versus last year. And when you think about the inflation level that I was talking about a bit before, you can see that this means that basically French consumers are buying less than last year. So the volume is declining versus last year as a direct impact of the inflation that we have reached in September 2022 and throughout the year in 2022. Another thing that is important to have in mind, because we were talking about how e-commerce is impacting the supply chain, and this is also one of the main changes and the main disruptions that we see in 2022 for the food industry, is product on shelf availability. And you can see basically that recently we have reached the lowest level in 2022 in terms of product on shelf availability. And this is one of the key challenges that retailers, that manufacturers will face in 2023. And another example of how supply chain improvement through digital, through data management, thanks to digital, can improve and help retailers and manufacturers partner in a better way. So before we jump into e-commerce trends in France in 2022 and over the last few years, a few reminders also in terms of how the population is changing. Again, this is true for France, but this is true for all European countries. Over the last 20 years, we've seen birth levels declining. We've seen death levels because of the baby boom impact increasing. What that means is that the growth coming from the population growth, so the consumption growth, the food industry growth coming from population growth is declining year after year. In a country like France, where consumption is very important for GDP growth, this is a main concern on the midterm or on the longer term. Another key impact of how the population is changing is the impact of COVID that we've seen in terms of geographical impact. People have left very urban centers, cities in France like Paris, like Lyon. We see the same pattern in Spain, in Italy, in Germany, where people are living for more rural areas. You see how basically food is growing in the west of France here, and this has an impact on what we shop and where we shop. Let's take the French example, where e-commerce with click and collect, drive, as we call it in France, the drive channel, is very strong in the western France. So obviously, as we have more people living in this part of the country, this is going to be beneficial for the click and collect channel overall. Another thing that is important to have in mind is how pre versus post-COVID shoppers have changed their shopping behavior. We've seen during COVID that people didn't go as often in stores. This is this dark green line that you see here. Remember what happened during the lockdowns in 2020. We didn't want to go in store. We didn't want to see anyone, basically, or meet anyone because we were worried about COVID. So people started to go less often in stores. They started to shop even more on e-commerce with bigger baskets each time they were shopping. So this impacted the frequency of shopping and increase the size of the basket. You can see that this year in 2022, frequency is going up again, reaching higher levels than pre-COVID, and basket is going down a little bit. And of course, this is also explained by the recent e-commerce evolution of the food industry in France. So let's go into that now. We were talking about how the FMCG business was growing this year, plus 1.3% versus last year in terms of value sales. You can see here, channel by channel, these are the channels that we cover within NielsenIQ. So hypermarkets, supermarket, discounters, convenience stores, and e-commerce. That does include click and collect. So the drive channel, you order online, you drive your car to the store, or home delivery, obviously. So you can see how e-commerce has grown over the last 20, but 10 years specifically. But this year, and this is new, we have a value sales decline for food e-commerce in France, but it's true as well throughout Europe. Of course, there's a part of mechanic decline because over the last 2 years, e-commerce has been growing more than 50%. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. The growth over the last 3 years is close to 50%, but we have a decline this year driven by the fact that we had a lot of buyers throughout the pandemic willing to buy online rather than offline. However, if we look at very recent trends in 2022 for total online sales, I'm not talking here only about food, but total online sales, sorry, you can see that recently, basically as of Q3, 2022 sales are starting to be better, to be higher than what we've seen in 2021. This wasn't true earlier this year because remember, 2021 in France specifically, we still had a lockdown early in the year, and of course, this was beneficial for online sales overall. So now, recently, over the last 2-3 months, the trend has been getting better and better than this year-to-date trend that we were just looking at in 2022. And when we look at the different industry that you can buy basically online, I'm not going to go through all the different departments, but you can see that between 2021 and 2022, that blue bar here, which is food, has been growing and is growing market share online on 100% online sales. So we clearly have a small decline this year. However, if we consider total online sales, the food industry is getting higher and bigger versus the previous years. And what is interesting to consider when we think about the future of e-commerce sales in France specifically is how much buyers keep coming online to buy food products. We're looking at what percent of the French population has been buying in the different channels, has been buying food in the different channels in France. And you can see that when we focus on e-commerce, there's been a big gap, obviously, between 2019 and 2020. So more buyers coming to shop online during the pandemic, but that growth kept on happening in 2021, but also in 2022. And this is true both for the drive channel, which remains in France the majority of the food sales of e-commerce, okay? Overall, 90% of online sales for food are coming from drive, click and collect, but home delivery is also growing its buyer base post-COVID. So that's a very good sign of what we think can be the future of e-commerce in the food industry, because e-commerce still grows its buyer base. Of course, basket size is going down a bit after 2 years, 2020, 2021, that were a bit crazy, but more and more shoppers are still coming online to buy food in France and in the rest of the world. So why is that? One of the first reasons is that even after COVID, the home office situation is still much higher than what we had before COVID. We think in France, for instance, that before COVID, even though that wasn't really measured very often, only 3% of the French population was working on a regular basis from home. Regular basis, meaning 2-3 days a week at least. Today, it's 18% of the French population, in average, even more in areas like Paris, for instance, that are working from home. And what we can see is that when we look at the channels where those people buy food versus the average population, there are two main channels where they go more often. Convenience stores, because it's close from their home, it's convenient. And e-commerce, because when you're working from home, well, obviously you're spending even more time on your laptop, you're more available to get the food delivered at home, you're more available to pick any time slot to go and get your food from the click and collect store. So this is a key driver of the continuous growth that we'll see in the future for e-commerce food in France. And as we look at the recent trends of e-commerce, the green line is 2022, the white line is 2021, e-commerce food in France. Obviously, we were talking about that decline, 1.9 decline versus 2021 a bit earlier, but you can see on the short term that the situation is getting better and that 2022 sales are now higher than what we had at the same period in 2029. So another sign that after what we faced early in 2022 because of the lockdown situation in 2021 and decline that we faced in 2022, we're getting back basically to a situation that we've known before COVID, where sales of online food is growing versus previous years. We were talking about click and collect versus home delivery for food in France. Keep in mind that click and collect, which is again the vast majority of sales, is declining because of what I was telling you before, because of the huge growth that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. However, home delivery, with a typo, home delivery is still doing better than in 2021. So 2022 sales are higher than 2021. Another thing that is very interesting in terms of home delivery, whereas click and collect is really about the big retail players, Leclerc, Carrefour, Auchan, etc., the home delivery environment, I would say, in terms of food industry, is getting more and more complex. Almost 50% of sales 2 years ago used to be done by major retail players. So again, the Carrefour, the Leclerc, etc. You can see how this is changing and how this has changed over the last 2 years. So the market share of those historical players is going down. You have pure players, think about Amazon, Cdiscount in France, for instance. You also have the DTC stores, okay, an Espresso, for instance, but also quick commerce and food delivery platform that we're going to talk about in a minute. So quick commerce, think about Getir, Gorillas, and others, and the food delivery platforms like Uber Eats, Deliveroo, etc., etc. So that's a big change in the food industry business over the last 2 years, thanks to the pandemic and thanks to other drivers as well, where the biggest retail players are losing ground, basically, versus new players. So I was telling you about quick commerce. A quick focus on quick commerce in France. We measure it as being now 2.5% of the total online FMCG market share, 2.5% for all the quick commerce players. So to give you a rough idea, the online value sales for food in France in 2022 is going to be around 12 billion euros, okay? So 2.5, we're talking about what? 300 million, 350, something like that. Just to give you a benchmark, the biggest hypermarket in France on an annual basis is selling 250 million euros. So quick commerce overall, we're talking about 300 million. The biggest hypermarket store, 250, okay? So that gives you a benchmark of how much we're talking about for quick commerce, and also how it might explain some of the things that you've seen in the press recently about how quick commerce is starting to struggle a bit. Obviously, quick commerce is going to be much bigger in specific areas like Paris, for instance, as you can see it here. Quick commerce, food delivery platforms now. What you can see here are 3 lines, gray for 2022 sales, 2021 sales in blue, and 2022 in green for food delivery platforms total in France. Obviously, 2020 showed a huge growth during the first lockdown. 2021 sales were much higher, and we're getting to, I would say, a lower level, a more normal level for 2022 for food delivery platform, but you can see how much we're still growing for food delivery platforms overall versus 2020, and obviously versus 2019, even if I didn't put the line on the graph. What does that mean for the different players of food delivery? To make it simple, you can see that the market shares for Uber Eats and Deliveroo have been pretty stable since 2020. Just Eat is getting smaller and smaller, and we have now that situation where basically Uber Eats is doing 60% of the market, and Deliveroo is doing 30% of the market. However, if we look in more details, we can see that there are differences in terms of, for instance, geography. We're using the example of Paris here, and you can see how Uber Eats and Deliveroo are basically not strong in the same locations. Deliveroo being stronger in the north and the east of Paris, Uber Eats being stronger in the south and the west of Paris. So different market shares overall, but different situations when you look at what's happening on the ground in specific cities. So that was an overview of one topic related to how digital is impacting the food industry with the example of the French situation and the French FMCG business. Now, how can digital expand even more tomorrow for the food industry? So just a few ideas that I know, again, that there are going to be other other talks today about some of those topics. I talked about supply chain earlier. Of course, automation, everything around technology, artificial intelligence is something where some of the major players of the food industry are investing quite a lot. Think about Walmart, think about Carrefour investing billions to improve their automation, their their warehouse automation. Gamification is another big thing. I think it's still not too well known in Europe, but if you go to Asia, if you talk to Asian consumers, this is something that is growing even more and more. It's helping retailers to increase loyalty. It's helping consumers to get better deals. And it might also be a way to redirect some of the consumption to more, for instance, healthy trends. Some of the retailers are using gamification to push consumers to buy more fruits or more vegetables, for instance, making them earn more points when they have a healthier diet, basically. Metaverse, which is going to be something that's probably going to get bigger and bigger. I think there's a talk a bit later about this one, but big players, as you can see, are investing on Metaverse, brands, but also retailers. NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which is also not too well known, but getting more and more traction. And also in terms of retail, more retail transformation, obviously DTC is still one of the big focus for some of the food players. Think about the coffee business, for instance, where DTC will probably get even bigger and bigger. The staffless stores, more and more retailers are moving to staffless stores. We even see the discounter channel, for instance, which is not what we could have think that would have been the first stores to go there, which are going more and more staffless and more automated. Rapid delivery, we talked about that through quick commerce, but also through the food delivery platform, of course, with some struggles recently. And then auto subscription, which is not completely new, but getting, again, more and more traction with more and more company investing on that, on this with different kind of models. There's one interesting example, which is the last one of the company called Repeat, which is basically looking at consumer data, trying to understand the consumer purchase pattern, understand how often they buy, how much they buy, to automatically offer them to reorder based on their previous purchase pattern. So these are the different types of investment that we see now happening for the food business. Now there's a key thing that's gonna make it or gonna break it. It's basically consumer willingness to use the metaverse, use NFTs, use et cetera, and make that even bigger. So when we ask consumers if they've already tried, that's the dark green, or if they're willing to try, which is the flash green, those different digital, I would say, innovation initiatives, you can see that for most of them, when you benchmark them with other items such as reduced plastic, low carbon impact, renewable energy, vertical farming, etc., these are not the most popular items because the awareness is still very low for most of them. So the first thing that needs to be done for the food industry is to make sure that this gets more and more known by the consumers to be able to drive adoption and to be able to make a bigger impact. And that was my last slide, so perfect timing. Thank you very much.